This is one of my favorite cut loose press patterns called Sonoma, and it gives the effect of a Delectable Mountains block, which has been around forever, but that block used to be very difficult to make. With these, you make them with large half square triangles that are actually cut from 10-inch squares, so it goes together very quickly and easily. This is made with a layer cake pack, but when you're using that, you need 30 10-inch squares. And so in this case, there were 2 of every print in there, so all of these were made with the exact same fabric. So it took 2 squares for this, 2 squares for this, etc. When I made this version out of K-Facet fabric, I could not duplicate the fabrics because every single square in the pack was a different fabric. So I made a scrappy version of this, and I love it just as much as the original. So you can get this out of a layer cake. You just have to make sure that there are at least 30 darks that you like to use because of the contrast with the background. So now I'm going to show you how to do this quickly and easily. I use the same background fabric, which is the celery color from Kona Cotton, and so for every 10-inch dark square I partnered it with a celery 10-inch square. I made large half square triangles by drawing a line from diagonal to diagonal and sewing 1/4 inch on each side of it. Then I cut on the drawn line, and when I open those up, I have 2 half square triangles. Now we need to trim these so that they're all the exact same size. You need a square that is at least 9 inches because I need to trim these down to exactly 9 inches, not 9.5. So the first trim is very simple to do because I don't care what size the whole thing is. I just want to make sure that all 3 nines have fabric underneath them, and it doesn't really matter how much I'm trimming off. I never cut off my tails until I'm doing this trimming because if something happens, I have to let the dog out or whatever, I can come back and I know that I haven't trimmed one corner yet, and so I can go back and fix that. So don't bother even wasting your time taking off those tails. You don't need to do it. So if you notice, I need 9-inch squares, so here's a 9, 9, and 9. They all have fabric underneath, so I'm going to trim one side and on the top. I'm going to flip this around. This time I do have to measure it so it's exactly a 9-inch square. So right here, that corner is on a 9-inch square. Here's a line on the 9 inches, here's a line on the 9 inches, and my diagonal goes on that seam line. So I'm going to trim the other 2 sides. Now there's very little waste when you do this. You can see that that's all I had from this, and I really prefer to trim them down to size because when you're working with layer cakes, we all know that they're not all cut exactly the same size, so you have a little bit of a fudge factor built in, and it's very simple to cut then when you're not trying to fudge it in and all of your blocks are the same size. So I've trimmed up several of them, and now I'm going to show you how you can trim them down very easily. The trick of this pattern is that when you're cutting these, you have to cut them so they form a mountain peak because I need a mirror image when I cut these. If you notice, I'm laying them on the grid on my rotary cutting mat, so it's square on 2 sides. So when I go to cut these, I can cut them out by using the lines on the mat and the lines on the ruler to make sure that I'm doing everything square. Now, I don't want to cut these out individually, and I don't want to stack them on top of each other because I would have all those that bulk where the seams were on top of each other because they wouldn't nest. So what I do is move up 1 inch, line it up again on the sides, and I continue stacking them this way because if I'm using this mat, I'll be able to cut 8 sets out at a time. If I'm using a 24 by 36 inch mat, I can cut 10 out at a time, which is 1/3 of the entire quilt. Now, as you can see, I could continue to stack those. I always leave an inch at the top and the bottom so I can read the lines on the mat and know exactly where I am. On this one, I love to use the 2.5 by 18.5 inch Creative Grids ruler. If I'm cutting less, I can also use the 12.5 inch version. It has the white line down the center, and it also has a 1/4 inch dash line on the side. That's the one I'm going to use for this quilt because these strips have to be 2 1/4 inches wide. So when you're trying to cut 1/4 inch lines, the lines are not as prominent as the 1/2 inch and whole inch on any ruler. So having that dash line on the outside edge, make sure that I am cutting exactly 2 1/4 inches and I don't have to look for those dash lines that go up the ruler. It's very simple. See how that's on the outside? Now I'm going to cut. Pull this aside, place that dash line on the outside edge again. Since that's 1/4 inch, I'm cutting 2 1/4 inches with my 2.5 inch ruler. And there are all my pieces. Now the magic happens when you flip these strip sets. So I'm going to take the outside two, flip them, the next set, and flip them, and continue to do that. And you can see the Delectable Mountains block forming because all of these angles are faced this way, all of these angles are faced that way. The only seam that has to line up right now is this one right here. So that's the only one I have to worry about because these are going to hit on the side. So it's a very simple quilt for beginners to do. Now I would take these to my sewing machine and I would take the top fabric and put it on the bottom because mine was scrappy. And now I'm going to take 2 and put them on the bottom, and 3 and put them on the bottom. And when I sew this together, you can see then I have 4 different fabrics for my Delectable Mountains block. Now I'll take these to the sewing machine and I'll sew those 3 seams just by putting this right sides together. And since they were all trimmed to 9 inches, they're the exact same length. And I'll sew that seam, pick up these 2 sets and sew those seams, and then sew the final seam. And that will be 1/4 of the block. I'll continue to do the same thing here. And you see what happens? Here's all my cuts. I'll sew the seams together and create this unit, and then when I put these 2 halves together, I have to match my seams here. So I prefer to press them open so there's not as much bulk in here, but you don't have to. It's totally your choice. And so see how you can make a quick and easy quilt that looks very difficult in just a matter of hours.